Hi everyone, I'm Elvira Barry, an author, and today I want to take you on a fascinating journey through the world of Soviet women. At the dawn of the 20th century, Soviet power pulled off the unthinkable. It gave women the right to vote and declared them equal to men. Revolutionary, right? But while the proclamations were grand, the reality on the ground was a little, let's just say, off script. The first Soviet leaders weren't exactly feminists. They were hardened revolutionaries, people who'd spent years in exile, dodging Tsarist police and rotting in prison cells. In places like that, relationships take on a very different tone. Imagine this: a strict, masculine hierarchy where women were either trophies to flaunt or assistants to fetch tea and type up revolutionary propaganda articles. That's the mindset these men brought to the table. Women revolutionaries who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with men on the battlefield hoped they'd be invited to share in the power. Nope. Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, shuffled into a ceremonial role. Alexander Kollontai shipped off as a diplomat. Vera Figner politely retired. In the early days of the Soviet Union, the ideal woman was a fiery revolutionary, a fearless Valkyrie willing to lay down her life for the cause. Larissa Reisner became the dazzling poster girl of this archetype. Another example is Lilia Brig, a Soviet socialite who captivated the imagination of Vladimir Mayakovsky, the most prominent poet of the Soviet era. Unbothered by the hardships of post-revolutionary Russia, Lilia immersed herself in creating a new Soviet artistic scene, shaping poetry, music, theater, and cinema. Men vied for her attention while women were baffled. Why her? She's not even pretty. But Lilia was the ultimate it girl of early Soviet Russia, armed with that elusive magic that left everyone under her spell. By the late 1920s, the ideal woman had splintered into two distinct images. For the working masses, it was the strong, healthy, and tireless laborer, someone ready to mix concrete, milk dozens of cows, or drive iron piles into the ground. But among the Soviet elite, the focus shifted from sacrifice to beauty and glamour. Party leaders found themselves gripped by midlife crisis. The Soviet utopia failed to materialize, the global revolution they'd dream of was not happening, and the USSR began to resemble a budget version of the Russian Empire. What was all this for? A typical party leader wondered. I am aging, and I haven't even lived. Disillusionment set in and priorities changed. Soviet leaders were secretly obsessed with Hollywood films but needed a Russian twist. Forget dainty flappers like Louise Brooke. Russian beauties were serious business. Think bold features, strength, and drama. The first stars of Soviet cinema embodied this unapologetic grandeur. Suddenly, success wasn't measured just by political achievements. It also required a stunning wife or lover to signal your success. Just look at these May-December romances. Semyon Budyonny, a Soviet military hero, married opera singer Mikhailova, 22 years his junior. Anatoly Lunacharsky, the Soviet Minister of Education, tied the knot with the theater actress Rosenthal, 25 years younger. Mikhail Kalinin, chairman of the Central Executive Committee, had a much younger operetta singer Bach as his mistress. Even Stalin's second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, though not actress, was over 2 decades younger than him. This was also the golden age of Russian ballet's revival. For Soviet men, the theater wasn't just about art. It was a socially accepted excuse to ogle beautiful bodies performing gravity-defying feats. For many women, marrying a party boss or a specialist was the fastest route to stability. a home, food from the special distribution centers, and maybe even some luxuries. Pre-World War II, many families had maids or nannies because survival demanded it. No washing machines, water outages, endless lines for groceries. Someone had to manage it all. Usually, it was a rural woman working for scraps because her village had even less. The housing crisis made things worse. Most families, even the privileged one, live in communal apartments sharing kitchens and bathrooms with strangers. Servants slept on floors or trunks in hallways. Women were expected to work because in the proletarian state, idleness was considered the ultimate sin. Moreover, a single income often could not support a family. While jobs offered perks like ration cards, vacation vouchers, and occasionally housing, women's salaries were much lower than those of men. Initially, the emancipation of women faced significant obstacles due to widespread illiteracy among women, but the new government took swift action to address this issue. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the state launched extensive literacy campaigns targeting both adults and children, while actively promoting the idea that a girl could aspire to become a doctor, scientist, engineer, or, in rare cases, even a manager. These efforts bore fruit. By the 1970s, seeing a woman in a managerial position was no longer surprising, except when it came to the upper echelons of the party elite. As in the past, the most prestigious roles remained firmly in the hands of men. However, there was no hesitation in assigning women to physically demanding jobs like stone carriers and loaders. In these cases, the Soviet state ensured true equality for both men and women. For propaganda purposes, the Soviet regime constantly sought examples of heroism and hard work. Officially, the USSR was a nation of workers and peasants, where labor achievements were celebrated above all else. This gave rise to the phenomenon of the udarnik, a person who worked more efficiently than others. Typically, this was a top-down initiative. Local officials were instructed to identify a suitable candidate, reward them, and write down glowing articles to showcase their accomplishments to the public. Being an udarnik was highly advantageous. It came with bonuses and perks, and public recognition often paved the way to a political career. Many udarniks eventually became members of the highest bodies of state authority and secured enviable positions. For example, in the 1930s, tractor driver Pasha Angelina became the symbol of a new generation of women mastering complex machinery. However, who was chosen as an udarnik often depended less on actual achievements and more on decisions made by local party officials. If your contributions weren't reported up the chain, or if those in charge deemed you unsuitable, your hard work was irrelevant. Another distinct category of women recognized by the state included heroines of the Great Patriotic War. That is what we call World War II. These women deserve a separate video. Hopefully, I'll get to that one day. It's also worth mentioning female cosmonauts and athletes who symbolized the USSR's lofty achievements. After retiring, they often found themselves in various councils or representative roles. Although women in the Soviet Union were rarely admitted to the highest echelons of power, many wielded significant authority at the local level. In a society where goods and opportunities were perpetually scarce, those responsible for distributing them had the power to make or break lives. More often than not, these roles were filled by women. For instance, a saleswoman at a shoe store might set aside coveted Yugoslavian boots for her useful acquaintances. In return, those acquaintances could offer favors, like helping her son secure admission to a university to avoid being drafted into the army. This system was called Bulat, and I have a separate video on this topic. School principals and deputy principals, predominantly women, often had nearly unlimited control over students. If these roles were occupied by domineering or cruel individuals, they could instill fear not only in the children, but also in their parents. A similar dynamics played out in trade unions. In the USSR, unions weren't about protecting workers' rights, but about allocating scarce perks. For example, a factory might distribute vacation vouchers, but not enough for everyone. Union representatives decided who got to vacation on the Black Sea resort and who had to settle for a mosquito-filled campsite near a local swamp. Judges were also often women, and they didn't always uphold justice. Corruption and nepotism were rampant in the USSR and widely accepted as the norm. To succeed, you needed to know how to live. In other words, secure a position that allowed you to control or allocate a valuable resource, which you could then leverage to fulfill your needs and take care of your family. Almost anything could become a resource. For example, a theater cloakroom attendant might refuse to take your winter coat if you arrived slightly late, claiming she had no space left. Without checking your coat, you couldn't enter the hall. Latecomers often had to negotiate to resolve this situation. Dormitory supervisors wielded similar power. A student who crossed one could risk losing their housing. This pattern was pervasive, extending through every layer of society. Even if a woman had a job, she was still expected to handle all the household chores. In rural Russia, gender roles were sharply divided due to the nature of agricultural labor. Many tasks were simply beyond a woman's physical strength, hauling logs or plowing fields, for example. Additionally, women were often either pregnant or nursing. Their responsibilities revolved around managing the household, cooking, washing, caring for children and the sick, as well as performing lighter field work and gathering mushrooms, berries, and herbs. Traditionally, feminine activities were seen as degrading for men. This mindset remained unchanged even after families moved to cities. Of course, exceptions existed, but in my grandmother's household, for instance, my grandfather never cooked, mopped floors, or made the bed. It was unthinkable. However, he would fetch water, chop wood, or fix broken items around the house. Anything involving technology or repairs was firmly labeled as men's work. Personally, I enjoy restoring antique furniture and tinkering with tools in my garage. Yet many of my Russian friends view this hobby as utterly unfeminine. Interestingly, in the US, furniture restoration is often done by women. I vividly remember the first time I saw a woman driving a car. I was about 7 years old, which makes it 1982. Until then, I had never seen a woman behind the wheel. I was so shocked that I froze in the middle of the road and began tugging at my grandmother's sleeve in alarm. I felt wrong. That simply wasn't how things were supposed to be. While women broke into traditionally male-dominated professions, the reverse rarely happened. In Soviet times, preschool teachers, school teachers, nurses, hairdressers, and cleaners were almost exclusively women. Similarly, working with fabric and thread was entirely seen as women's work. In our region, the idea of a man engaging in such activities was unimaginable. Retail work was also considered a women's domain. Men in stores typically held managerial roles or worked as loaders. They could also be found in meat departments or special government distribution centers, areas where their masculinity was not questioned. A woman might become a respected poet or illustrator, or at most a children's author. But the idea of a woman being a celebrated novelist was laughable. The term women's novel carried a dismissive tone, evoking derision from literary enthusiasts, both male and female. The same applied to invention, philosophy, and law. A woman wasn't seen as capable of being an innovator, thinker, or negotiator. But one thing women could do was beg for alms, though only after growing old. Officially, the USSR claimed there were no destitute people, but in reality, the poor existed everywhere. A man could only beg if he was really old or disabled. On the other hand, there was no shortage of elderly female beggars. When I first moved to California, I was surprised to see that most of the local panhandlers were middle-aged men. So strange. Countless wars created a severe gender imbalance in the Soviet Union. According to the 1959 census, there were only 641 men for every 1,000 women. In some villages, one man, often disabled, missing an eye or a leg, had to contend with dozens of young women seeking marriage. This shortage profoundly altered family culture in the later Soviet years. A man deemed marriage material became an object of fierce competition, and standards for an acceptable husband dropped significantly. My grandmother Zinaida, for instance, had just one criterion: as long as he does not drink. For many women, being married even to a fool or an alcoholic was considered far better than remaining single, as a marriage was a crucial marker of social status. Despite Soviet society's male-centric narratives, many families functioned under an unofficial matriarchy. Women took charge of raising children, managing finances, and overseeing household affairs. They were also often the primary resource gatherers, leveraging relationships with friends and relatives to secure essential goods and opportunities. Men were expected to hand over their wages to their wives, who would then allocate the money as they saw fit. This dynamic placed Soviet men in a strange and often disempowering position. A man couldn't fully fulfill his traditional role as a provider or protector because so much in life depended on the state, not him. Men often worked grueling, thankless jobs with no real prospects, leaving them feeling unfulfilled. Traditional attitudes dismissed self-care as unmanly. Visiting doctors or looking after one's health was seen as a weakness. Overcrowded living conditions meant men had no refuge. The only private space available was the bathroom, and even there, neighbors or family members would eventually start knocking. Wives expected help with housework, given that women worked just as much as men. But for many men, this felt like a challenge to their masculinity. Many men lived far from their childhood homes and had lost touch with childhood friends. Often, they lacked close friendships altogether. Despite being surrounded by people, they felt deeply lonely. Spousal friendships were rare. The culture lacked examples or traditions that encouraged emotional closeness between partners. In traditional societies, boys were raised primarily by men, fathers, uncles, and older brothers, who took them to hunt, work in the fields, or learn trades. This fostered a sense of belonging to the broader community of manhood. In contrast, in the Soviet Union, a boy's life was largely shaped by women, mothers, grandmothers, and teachers. Many boys grew up without positive male role models, and some never encountered examples of healthy male behavior at all. Most men need to be a part of a male community where other respected men recognize their value. Throughout history, such communities have taken many forms: hunting parties, military units, exclusive clubs, sports teams, and even pirate crews or mafia networks. In the Soviet Union, the government suppressed these male spaces out of fear of dissent. To the outside world, Soviet men seemed to embody ruggedness and brute strength. In reality, they were grappling with a profound crisis of masculinity, leading to destructive behaviors. Their inability to live up to traditional or personal ideals of masculinity drained their energy and undermined their purpose. As a result, widespread alcoholism and early mortality became defining issues among Soviet men, further worsening their gender imbalance. In my own community, women often lived 25 years longer than men. Soviet women suffered just as much from their masculinity crisis as men did. They yearned for partners who could solve problems, provide resources, and take responsibility. However, for many, such men existed only on the silver screen. A popular joke on the Russian internet suggests that same-sex families existed in the USSR long before they appeared in the West. Due to the severe shortage of men, many households consisted of mothers, grandmothers, and children. Ironically, the same women who longed for strong, capable men often raised generations of confused and insecure sons. Starved for male attention, mothers and grandmothers would dote on their boys, shielding them from danger, challenges, and decision-making. This gave rise to the archetype of the mama's boy, a man who habitually shifted responsibility onto others. These men found themselves torn between the desire to prove their masculinity and the need to appease the women who dominated their lives. If such a man married, it often ended in a quick divorce, as his mother would meddle in the young couple's affairs. Inevitably, the mama's boy would return to live with his mother, staying by her side until her death, or his own. The women around him would heave heavy sighs, roll up their sleeves and mutter, "Just stay out of the way," before taking on all the household responsibilities themselves. Then, in their rare moments of respite, they would watch films about brave officers, heroic Soviet spies, or Bollywood machos. Yes, Indian movies were extremely popular in the USSR. In rural areas, people had as many children as nature allowed. Children were seen as both additional labor and a guarantee of care in old age. The concept of family planning simply didn't exist. If a farmer's wife had more children than she could support, she would simply stop feeding an unwanted baby. Child rearing and education were not pressing concerns in the village. The entire community took responsibility for raising kids. Teenagers looked after the younger children, literacy was rarely taught, and as soon as a child was old enough to follow instructions, they were put to work. But when women began moving to cities, the situation changed dramatically. Cramped and inadequate housing left families with no space for children. The state attempted to assist mothers, as the country desperately needed new citizens after several devastating wars. Women were granted paid maternity leave, and nurseries, hospitals, and schools were built nationwide. In 1936, abortion was outlawed, but with no access to contraception, illegal and unsafe abortions became rampant. Women resorted to horrifying methods, knitting needles or even onions inserted into the uterus. By 1944, there were 30.5 abortions per 100 pregnancies in the Soviet Union. After Stalin's death, abortion was legalized again and became the primary method of family planning. Nearly every Soviet woman who was sexually active underwent at least one abortion in her lifetime. By the mid-1960s, Soviet women were having an estimated 7 million abortions per year. The post-war era also saw a dramatic decline in birth rates. While a typical family once had 4 or 5 surviving children, the new norm dropped to 2 or fewer. So there was no baby boom in the Soviet Union after World War II. According to Soviet traditions, a woman was expected to marry between the ages of 18 and 22, with the first child arriving shortly thereafter. Whether you found a partner was often a matter of luck. One of my grandmothers met her husband at a dance, while the other met my grandfather on a steamboat trip. My aunt found her spouse at work. As for my parents, my father saw my mother on the street and immediately decided she was the woman of his dreams. My mother was stunningly beautiful, and many admired her, but only my father had the courage to approach her, strike up a conversation, and escort her home. The next day, my mother returned from school to find him in her kitchen, happily eating borscht and charming her mother. My grandmother was thoroughly impressed, and that sealed the deal. She told my mother that he was the perfect suitor and that she should snatch him up immediately. He is bound to become a minister. While my father didn't become a minister, he did become an inventor, and I even have a separate video about his wild and fascinating life. The acute shortage of suitable men meant that those considered desirable or prestigious often maintained second families or long-term mistresses. I knew a woman born in 1951 who worked as a secretary for various bosses throughout her life. She was very attractive, but never married. Instead, she pursued a different strategy. She became the mistress of her superiors, earning herself an apartment, a car, and many other gifts. For women who could not find a suitable partner, fleeting vacation romances were often the only option. Having affairs with married men at home was challenging. Not only was there no private space, but being caught could lead to severe consequences if colleagues or neighbors found out. However, while on vacation far from prying eyes, people felt freer to indulge in temporary flings. Some women resorted to placing personal ads in newspapers, looking to meet a good man. But this often came across as desperate. Local cultural centers also hosted events for those over 30, but in Soviet terms, being over 30 was seen as hopelessly past one's prime. Middle-aged women struggled to find partners because their peers often sought younger brides. The USSR worshipped youth. Foreign visitors often remarked on the abundance of beautiful young women, but noted the absence of attractive middle-aged women. Older women were automatically relegated to the role of babushka, a shapeless figure in their headscarf and coat. This old age often began around 45 or 50. This happened because family resources were scarce and there was simply not enough to go around for both children and parents. Families prioritized their daughters during their youth, investing everything in them in hopes they would secure good marriages or positions at prestigious enterprises. To do so, girls had to be appealing. Over time, work, poor health care, economic struggles, and family issues took their toll. Once a woman lost her youthful charm, her opportunities dried up. All she had left was the capital she managed to build in her younger years. Elderly women rarely found new partners. After my grandfather passed away, my grandmother Diana had an old admirer, Uncle Kostya, who began courting her. However, my grandmother found the idea improper. They were both over 60. Despite her loneliness, she only occasionally allowed him to help her, and even then, only on the condition that he told no one. Society expected grandmothers to forego their personal lives entirely and dedicate themselves to helping their adult children. Grandmothers often scrimped on their own needs, lent money to their children, and looked after their grandchildren. While this wasn't universal, it was considered the norm. A grandmother unwilling to help with grandchildren faced harsh societal judgment. In the next part of my story about Russian women, we'll move to modern times and explore how women lived after the USSR's collapse. Subscribe to my channel, and if you are fascinated by Russian culture and history, visit my website and sign up for updates on my historical novel series Russian Treasures. I'll share with you an incredible story about a woman who captivates and inspires me to this day.